You should be grateful you're even allowed at this table. My mother, Victoria Carter, said those exact words to me. She didn't whisper them quietly, so only I could hear. She didn't say them in passing while we were alone in the kitchen. She said them loudly, clearly, and right in the middle of our early Christmas dinner at the family mansion in Savannah, Georgia. Before I could even process the sting of her words, my Aunt Margaret chimed in, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. At least we still remember your name. The whole table laughed at that. My dad, Richard, a wealthy real estate developer, chuckled as he took a sip of his wine. My younger sister, Lily, who was the absolute golden child of the family, smiled brightly. Even the family friend sitting at the end of the table laughed along like it was the punchline to a brilliant joke that I looked down at my empty hands resting on my lap, then back up at them. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw a fit. I just nodded slowly and said, "Good, so I understand my place. Let me back up a little bit and explain how we got here. My name is Amelia Carter. I am 31 years old, and I work professionally as a high-end event and lighting designer. I make a very good living. I have my own place, and I am completely financially independent. But in my family, none of that matters at all. This particular dinner was supposed to be a nice, early holiday celebration before everyone got too busy with the season. My mom is a massive deal in the local philanthropic scene. She absolutely lives for the public admiration she receives from hosting these wealthy gatherings. My sister Lily is her favorite person in the world, mostly because Lily just smiles and makes the family look perfect. Meanwhile, Aunt Margaret, my mom's sister, is well known around town for being incredibly bitter and mean, but she and my mom are inseparable. After the main course was cleared, my mom stood up to hand out the Christmas gifts to everyone at the table. She always makes a massive show of it, ensuring everyone sees how generous she is. First, she handed Lily a long velvet box. When my sister opened it, she found a stunning diamond necklace. Lily squealed with joy and ran over to hug my mom. Next, my mom handed my dad a heavy, polished wooden box. Inside was a rare antique watch he had been wanting for months. He smiled warmly and thanked her. Then it was Aunt Margaret's turn. Mom handed her a thick envelope. Margaret opened it up and pulled out an exclusive itinerary for a luxury vacation in Europe. Margaret actually teared up, which is rare for her. Even the family friend sitting with us received a very expensive, nicely wrapped gift. I sat there quietly, waiting for my turn. I watched my mom sit back down, smooth out her expensive dress, and pick up her wine glass. Only I got nothing. No envelope, no box, not even a card. I looked at her, confused, and that is exactly when she dropped the line about how I should just be grateful to be invited to eat with them. Her eyes were totally cold when she said it. It was her direct way of reminding me that I was an outsider in my own family, a lower-class citizen in her perfect house. And the crazy part, I actually expected it. This blatant favoritism and exclusion has been going on for years. When I was 17 years old, I won a massive national lighting design award. It was a huge milestone for me and a big deal in the industry. The award ceremony was out of town, and I desperately wanted my parents to be there to support me. My mom flat out refused to go. Her excuse: Lily had a piano recital on the same day. It wasn't even a major competition, just a regular recital, but my mom insisted Lily needed her there. So, I traveled to my ceremony and stood on that stage completely alone. When I was 23, I landed my first major professional contract. I was hired to do the entire lighting design for the historic Magnolia Hall. I was incredibly proud of myself and drove straight home to tell my family the good news that my family didn't congratulate me. They didn't ask about the contract or my designs. Instead, they just looked at me and asked, "Can you help decorate Mom's charity gala?" From that exact moment, my role in the family was permanently cemented. I became the invisible person working strictly behind the scenes for the family's benefit. 4 years now, my family has hosted a massive annual event called the Carter Winter Heritage Gala. It is a huge charity ball that brings in roughly $3 million every single year. If you look at the public reputation of the event, or read the local news, you would think Victoria Carter does absolutely everything herself. The public views my mom as the absolute soul of the event. People constantly praise her for her hard work, her vision, and her dedication to charity. But the reality is entirely different. I am the one who does absolutely everything. I do all of the complex lighting design. I build and manage the entire donation website from scratch. I set up and run the payment processing systems, so the money actually goes through. I write and organize all the sponsorship materials that convince rich donors to give us money. I manage all the vendors, dealing with the caterers, the florists, and the rental companies. I also do all the stage design. I literally build the digital and physical infrastructure that makes the entire gala function, and yet, my name is always hidden. My mom explicitly told me years ago that it was better for the brand if my name wasn't on anything public. Like an idiot craving her approval, I agreed and just kept doing the heavy lifting in the shadows. Sitting at that dinner table in Savannah, watching Lily admire her new diamonds and Margaret boast about her upcoming trip to Europe, something inside me just quietly snapped. I realized I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn a seat at a table where they actively enjoyed humiliating me. I was killing myself, working endless 80-hour weeks leading up to the gala every year, just so my mom could take all the credit and still treat me like garbage. That I finished my glass of water, stood up from the table, and pushed my chair in. I didn't say a single word. I didn't say goodbye to my dad, I didn't look at Lily, and I certainly didn't thank my mom for the meal. I just walked straight out the front door, got into my car, and started the long drive back to my home. I drove in total silence. My mind was racing through every unpaid invoice I had processed for them, every late night I spent coding her donation site, and every time she took the microphone at the gala to accept praise for my hard work. By the time I hit the city limits, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to yell at them or beg for their love anymore. I was simply going to give them exactly what they asked for. They wanted to treat me like I didn't exist? Fine. I would stop existing for them. Let's see exactly how the great Victoria Carter runs her $3 million charity empire without her invisible daughter doing all the work. The gala was only a few weeks away, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. It was exactly 2 days after that miserable Christmas dinner when the real turning point happened. I was sitting on my couch in my apartment in Atlanta, trying to decompress from the long drive and the lingering humiliation. I was scrolling blindly through my phone, not really looking at anything, just letting the mindless social media feed distract my brain from overthinking. That is exactly when I saw it. A short, 15-second video was posted on an Instagram story. It belonged to the family friend who had been sitting at the end of our dinner table, the one who had received a lovely gift and laughed right along with everyone else. They must have been recording the visual aesthetic of the dinner table, panning their camera across the expensive crystal glasses, the massive roasted turkey, and the extravagant floral centerpiece my mother had ordered. But they forgot to mute the audio. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to check before posting. Clear as day, cutting sharply through the background noise of clinking silverware, you could hear my mother's voice. Be grateful you're even allowed here. It was perfectly captured. The camera even panned fast enough to catch my mother's cold, dismissive expression as she said the words, followed instantly by Aunt Margaret's cruel, barking laugh. The video was only up for about 20 minutes before it was abruptly deleted. I imagine my mother, or perhaps my sister Lily, realized what it sounded like to the general public and panicked, forcing the friend to take it down immediately. But 20 minutes is an absolute eternity on the internet. I screen recorded it and saved the file securely to my phone long before it vanished. Watching that short clip over and over again shifted something permanent inside my brain. It wasn't just my memory of the event anymore. It was documented reality. I wasn't being overly sensitive, and I wasn't being dramatic. My family was genuinely awful to me, and they were perfectly comfortable being awful to me in front of an audience that I needed a serious reality check. So I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Daniel Reyes. Daniel is a brilliant guy who works professionally as a nonprofit lawyer. He knows the complex ins and outs of charity organizations, corporate structures, and legal liabilities better than anyone I know. More importantly, he knows my family dynamic. He has watched me run myself into the ground, working endless unpaid hours for my mother for years. That I explained everything that happened at the dinner, the luxury gifts given to everyone else, the cruel comments, and finally the leaked video. I told him I was completely done, that I couldn't stomach doing the heavy lifting for the gala this year. I was half expecting him to tell me to calm down, to just bite my tongue, get through the event, and then slowly distance myself. But Daniel didn't do that at all. Instead, he said something that completely changed my perspective and set the course for everything that followed. He told me, "Amelia, They aren't afraid of hurting you. They're only afraid of losing their access to you. That single sentence felt like a physical punch to the chest. He was absolutely right. My mother didn't value me as a daughter. She valued my free, highly skilled labor. Aunt Margaret didn't respect me. She respected the luxury lifestyle and public praise my work helped fund. They didn't fear my absence at the family dinner table, but they would be absolutely terrified over my absence from the Carter Winter Heritage Gala production office. That was the exact moment the sadness completely evaporated, replaced by a very calm, very sharp sense of purpose. I told Daniel I wanted to cut them off entirely. Not just a temporary silent treatment, but a full, professional, and legal severing of ties. I asked him where I legally stood if I just walked away right now, with the gala only weeks away. Daniel advised me to immediately check every single contract, payment account, design ownership file, and website administration right related to the gala. He told me to figure out exactly whose name was on the dotted line for the digital and physical infrastructure of this massive $3 million machine that I opened my laptop and started digging. I spent the next 6 hours pulling up every digital file, every vendor agreement, and every server hosting receipt I had ever processed for the event. What I found actually made me laugh out loud in my empty apartment, because my mother was so obsessed with hiding my involvement to protect her brand as the sole mastermind, she had completely insulated herself from the actual operations. She hadn't wanted her own name, or the charity's main name, bogged down with the technical liabilities of running the back-end systems. So, over the years, she had casually told me to just set things up however was easiest for me to manage. The easiest way for me had been to run everything through my own professional corporate entity. As I reviewed the documents, I realized that a staggering 90% of the gala's operational systems were legally registered under my own LLC, the custom donation website that processed millions of dollars, registered solely to my company, the secure payment gateways and merchant accounts, under my name, the intricate stage and lighting design blueprints that the production crews needed to physically build the venue, copyrighted entirely to my design firm, the administration rights for the vendor management portal, my email, my passwords, my two-factor authentication that I wasn't just a quiet volunteer helping out behind the scenes. On paper, legally and operationally, I was the sole proprietor of the event's entire infrastructure. My mother was basically just a very loud, very expensive public mascot that I called Daniel back and read him the detailed list of what I legally owned. I could hear the shock in his voice. He confirmed that since I had never signed over the intellectual property to the charity, and the accounts were fully in my business name, I had full legal authority to shut it all down. They were my tools, my assets, and my platforms that IT was time to drop the bomb. I sat at my kitchen island and drafted what Daniel and I later referred to as the bombshell email. I didn't write it emotionally. I didn't mention the Christmas dinner, the diamond necklace, or the deleted Instagram story. I kept it strictly professional, incredibly cold, and legally binding that I addressed the email to the entire charity board of directors, the primary corporate sponsors who funded the event, the high-end printing companies, the event organizers, and the bank representatives handling the escrow accounts. These were the exact people who actually made the gala happen, the ones who truly believed Victoria Carter was the solitary genius behind the curtain. The subject line was simple: immediate change of operations, Carter Winter Heritage Gala. I end the body of the email. I formally announced that I was withdrawing my entire role from the gala, effective immediately. I stated clearly that due to unforeseen professional conflicts, my firm would no longer be providing any operational, digital, or design support for the event. Then came the most important sentence, the one Daniel helped me phrase perfectly to ensure there were absolutely no legal loopholes. I typed, "Please be advised that any use of my payment systems, proprietary designs, website infrastructure, or professional reputation from this point forward is strictly unauthorized." I attached a highly detailed list of the specific systems and digital assets that were being immediately revoked. I also included a polite but firm note informing the board of directors that they would need to urgently secure alternative arrangements for their payment processing and event design, as my servers would be taken completely offline at midnight. I read the email over 3 times. My finger hovered over the send button. A small, deeply conditioned part of me, the little girl who just desperately wanted her family to be proud of her, hesitated. If I sent this, there was no going back. It would humiliate my mother in front of the very people she worshipped. It would throw a massive, highly publicized charity event into absolute chaos just weeks before it was scheduled to happen. Then I thought about the video. Be grateful you're even allowed here. I wasn't destroying their event. I was just taking my things and going home. They didn't want me at their table, so I was simply taking the table away that I clicked send. The email vanished from my outbox, instantly delivering itself to the inboxes of the most powerful and influential people in Savannah's high society. I closed my laptop, walked into my kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. For the first time in over a decade, my chest felt incredibly light. The invisible, crushing weight I had been carrying for my family was completely gone, and I knew the fallout was going to be biblical. The gala was less than a month away, and I had just ripped the digital and logistical spine right out of the operation. My mother was about to wake up to a nightmare she couldn't charm her way out of. But for that night, I slept better than I had in years, completely unaware of just how explosive the next 24 hours were going to be. The morning after I sent that email, my phone was alarmingly quiet for exactly 8 hours. Then, all hell broke loose. Within the first 24 hours, the entire operational structure of the Carter Winter Heritage Gala completely collapsed. The donation website, which typically processes hundreds of thousands of dollars in early ticket sales and VIP table reservations during this specific week, was entirely locked down. Anyone who tried to access the main landing page or the payment portal was simply met with a blank, gray error screen stating that the server hosting had been permanently suspended. Because my LLC legally held the merchant accounts, I had to freeze the automated escrow payouts. This meant that all of our major vendors instantly received automated legal notifications that their upcoming contracts were paused. The high-end catering company, which was supposed to start ordering imported ingredients that very morning, completely halted their workflow. The premium floral designers, the lighting crew, the valet service, and the security team all immediately stopped what they were doing and started demanding answers. In the high-stakes world of luxury event planning, nobody lifts a single finger unless the money is actively cleared and guaranteed in their accounts. Then came the absolute worst part for my mother. The major corporate sponsors started demanding explanations. We're talking about massive banking executives and local real estate moguls who write $50,000 checks just to have their company logo printed on the gala's step and repeat banner. They were furious. They were getting bounce-back messages from the payment gateways and hearing rumors from the vendors that the event was suddenly unfunded. They immediately started calling the charity's board of directors, looking for my mother. The board of directors panicked and called an emergency meeting. This is when the event organizers and the board finally discovered the undeniable truth. I was the actual operator running the entire show. For years, they had blindly trusted my mother when she stood at the podium and claimed she personally organized every single detail of the massive event. When they confronted her about the frozen systems and the vendor lockouts, my mother tried to play her usual public relations game. She aggressively downplayed my involvement, telling everyone in the room that I was just her daughter who helped out a little bit with the computers and the internet stuff. She promised them it was just a minor technical glitch that she would personally sort out by the end of the day, but the board wasn't stupid. When you're dealing with a $3 million charity machine, you don't just take someone's word for it. The primary event organizers bypassed my mother entirely and pulled the official corporate incorporation documents, the vendor agreements, and the bank routing information. Right there, in plain black and white on every single legally binding document, it explicitly listed the true director of operations, Amelia Carter. It wasn't my mother's name. It wasn't the charity's name. It was me. They instantly realized that Victoria Carter had absolutely no administrative access, no passwords, no vendor authority, and zero operational control over her own flagship event. While my mother was busy trying to lie to the board of directors in Savannah, I was sitting in my apartment in Atlanta with my lawyer friend, Daniel. Since I was officially pulling my company out of the charity's operations, Daniel advised me that we needed to conduct a highly thorough, completely independent internal audit of the financial records. We had to make absolutely sure that my LLC was legally cleared and that we weren't accidentally holding on to any legitimate charity funds or outstanding vendor invoices that could get me sued later. We spent hours combing through the digital ledgers, matching every single receipt to the corresponding bank transfer. That is when we found the financial discrepancies. At first, I thought it was just a clerical error. I noticed a massive charge for the gala's floral arrangements, which always cost a fortune. But as I looked closer, I saw that the exact same invoice had been submitted, processed, and refunded twice. I pulled up the vendor payout logs and traced the routing numbers. My Aunt Margaret, who volunteered on the event's purchasing committee, had deliberately authorized a double refund for the exact same category of luxury flowers, effectively pocketing a staggering $48,000 directly into her personal account. I felt sick to my stomach, but Daniel told me to keep digging. If Margaret was boldly skimming that kind of money off the top of a highly publicized charity event, there was a very good chance she wasn't the only one treating the donation pool like a personal piggy bank. We started specifically filtering the expense reports tied directly to my mother's corporate card. The deeper we dug into the records, the worse it got that I found dozens of highly questionable transactions categorized vaguely as event preparation or venue scouting. When I cross-referenced the dates and the merchant IDs, the truth was glaringly obvious. My mother was actively using the charity's tax-exempt funds to pay for her own lavish lifestyle. There were massive charges for ultra-luxury spa retreats, five-star hotel stays that had absolutely nothing to do with the gala's location, and thousands of dollars spent on high-end designer clothes. She was literally buying the expensive dresses she wore to the charity dinners using the money people had donated to help the community. Daniel and I sat there in stunned silence as we calculated the final numbers. When we added up Aunt Margaret's fraudulent floral refunds and my mother's extravagant personal expenses, the total amount of highly suspicious, completely unaccounted for money came out to exactly $312,000. Over $300,000 of donor money was just gone, funneled directly into my family's pockets to maintain their wealthy, perfect public image that I didn't even have time to fully process the sheer scale of the financial betrayal before my phone finally rang. It was my mother. I stared at the caller ID for a long time, watching her name flash across the screen. I knew she wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling because the board of directors had likely cornered her, the vendors were screaming for their deposits, and she finally realized she couldn't charm her way out of a hard-locked server. I took a deep breath, braced myself for the incoming explosion, and answered the phone. She didn't even say hello. She didn't ask how I was doing. Her voice was trembling with absolute rage, completely stripped of the polished, polite tone she used in public. She screamed directly into the receiver, telling me that I was being a selfish, ungrateful child. She told me I was completely overreacting to a harmless family dinner, and that my little stunt with the website was causing unnecessary drama. And then, she dropped the exact line I knew she would. She yelled, "You are destroying the family." I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I just sat there, looking at the spreadsheet on my laptop screen showing $312,000 of stolen charity funds. I kept my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of any emotion, and I simply said, "No, I'm just stopping the cover-up," that I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I didn't block her number, but I put my phone on silent and tossed it onto the couch. The absolute silence in my apartment felt incredible. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that keeping their secrets and doing their heavy lifting was my only value. But now, the truth was officially documented, the money trail was completely exposed, and the perfectly curated reputation of the Carter family was rapidly collapsing in real time. I knew they wouldn't just accept this and walk away quietly. They were desperate, and desperate people do crazy things. I just had no idea they were already packing their bags to come find me. Exactly 1 week passed since that explosive, one-sided phone call with my mother. I spent those 7 days working quietly from my home office, ignoring the countless missed calls from unknown numbers, and letting my lawyer friend, Daniel, handle the legal fallout with the charity's board of directors. I honestly thought they would try to handle the massive disaster locally in Savannah. I figured they would hire a crisis management team, spin a complex lie to the public, and quietly try to rebuild the event from scratch without me. I severely underestimated their desperation. It was a Tuesday evening when the aggressive, furious pounding on my apartment door started. It wasn't a normal, polite knock. It was the kind of heavy, rhythmic, demanding banging that instantly spikes your adrenaline and makes you think the police are standing out in the hallway. I put down my laptop, walked over to the entryway, and looked through the peephole. I let out a long, exhausted sigh. Standing right there in the hallway of my Atlanta apartment building, looking completely out of place and absolutely furious, was my entire family. They had actually packed into my father's luxury SUV and driven 4 straight hours from Savannah just to corner me in my own home. Did I unlock the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before I could even say a word of greeting, Aunt Margaret shoved her way right past me. She was carrying a heavy, oversized cardboard box overflowing with manila folders, financial binders, and legal papers. She marched straight into the center of my living room and dropped the box onto my coffee table with a loud, deliberate thud. My mother, Victoria, walked in right behind her, her face tense and pale. Then came my father, Richard, who wouldn't even make eye contact with me as he stepped inside. Finally, my younger sister Lily walked in, hovering near the back of the group. Lily didn't look angry. She just looked incredibly confused and deeply uncomfortable, like she had been dragged along against her will. I closed the front door, crossed my arms over my chest, and leaned against the wall, watching them completely take over my living space. Victoria didn't waste a single second. She instantly turned on the waterworks. The cold, screaming woman from the phone call a week ago was completely gone. In her place was a fragile, weeping mother playing the ultimate victim. She started sobbing softly, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a tissue, acting as if I had physically attacked her. Margaret, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with raw aggression. She glared at me like I was a common criminal who had just broken into her house. My father remained completely silent, just hovering near the kitchen island with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring at the floorboards. Lily stood near the entryway, her eyes darting between all of us in pure shock, completely unsure of what was actually happening. Margaret slapped a thick, stapled stack of papers down on top of the cardboard box. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger at the documents and told me exactly why they had driven 4 hours to my apartment. The box was full of files and legal papers they desperately needed me to sign immediately. According to Margaret, the charity board of directors was actively threatening to bring in state financial investigators. The massive corporate sponsors were preparing aggressive lawsuits for breach of contract, and the local Savannah news outlets were starting to ask serious, probing questions about why the famous Carter Winter Heritage Gala was abruptly shutting down its operations. The family had a plan to fix the entire mess, and naturally, that plan involved throwing me completely under the bus. Victoria stepped forward, her voice shaking with fake, theatrical emotion, and explained the paperwork they had brought. They had hired a very expensive crisis management lawyer to draft a legally binding public statement. The document explicitly stated that the entire server shut down, the locked merchant accounts, and most importantly, the massive financial discrepancies in the charity's accounts, were all the direct result of a catastrophic administrative error on my part. They wanted me to officially put my signature on a piece of paper taking full responsibility for losing over $300,000 of donor funds. They wanted me to legally confess to gross professional incompetence so they could save the charity event and protect their pristine, wealthy public reputation. I stood there in absolute disbelief. After years of treating me like invisible garbage, after humiliating me at the Christmas dinner table, and after secretly stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from a non-profit organization, their grand solution was to drive to my house and demand I take the legal fall for their own financial crimes. Margaret barked at me to go find a pen. She aggressively insisted that if I signed the papers right now, they could release a press statement by morning, blame the entire mess on a software glitch caused by my design company, and smoothly refund the missing money from their own personal accounts over time without anyone asking any more questions. I looked at each of them in silence. I looked at my dad, Richard, a man who built his entire real estate empire on being a tough, uncompromising businessman. Yet here he was, standing in cowardly, dead silence while his wife and sister tried to force his oldest daughter to sign a fake legal confession. I looked at Lily. The golden child was staring down at the thick stack of papers on the coffee table, her mouth hanging slightly open. For the very first time in her completely sheltered, perfectly funded life, Lily was looking right at the ugly, toxic machinery that kept our family's flawless public image running. She looked genuinely horrified as she slowly realized what they were asking me to do. Victoria noticed that I wasn't moving toward the table. She dropped the crying act for just a second. Her face hardened, and her voice dropped right back into that familiar, harsh tone she always used when she wanted to control my behavior. She looked me dead in the eyes, pointed at the papers, and said, "You are destroying the family's future." She actually thought that line would work. She genuinely believed that the old guilt trip would immediately trigger my deeply ingrained childhood need to please her. She thought I would just put my head down, apologize for making a mess, and sign my career away to protect her. But that version of Amelia died at the dinner table a week ago that I didn't yell back at her. I didn't cry, and I didn't try to defend my actions. I just calmly walked over to my home office desk, sitting in the corner of the room. I picked up a neat, highly organized black folder containing the printed results of the independent financial audit Daniel and I had run. I walked back over to the coffee table and dropped my folder right next to their ridiculous, typed-up fake confession that I flipped my folder open. Right on top of the stack were the explicitly highlighted vendor invoices, the duplicated banking logs, and the printed email routing numbers proving exactly where the missing charity money went. It clearly detailed Margaret's double-dipped floral refunds and listed every single one of my mother's luxury spa retreats and high-end clothing store purchases paid for directly with tax-exempt donor funds that I tapped my index finger firmly on the undeniable paper trail proof of their fraud. I looked right back at my mother. My voice was completely steady, entirely devoid of the fear and desperation she was so used to hearing from me that I looked at the fake confession, then back at her face and said, "I didn't destroy it. I just turned on the lights." The absolute silence in my apartment after I dropped that black folder onto the coffee table was heavy enough to suffocate someone. For several long seconds, nobody moved. My dad, Richard, continued staring at the floor, perfectly imitating a piece of furniture. My sister, Lily, was still frozen near the entryway, her eyes wide as she tried to process the sudden shift in the room's energy. Aunt Margaret was the first one to break the quiet. She let out a highly exaggerated, dismissive scoff, clearly thinking my black folder was just a desperate bluff. She aggressively snatched it off the table, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together as she flipped the cover open. I watched her eyes dart across the very first page. It was the heavily highlighted spreadsheet detailing the exact floral vendor invoices from the past 3 years. It took exactly 3 seconds for Margaret's arrogant expression to completely dissolve into pure, unadulterated panic. She was looking directly at the printed bank routing numbers that proved she had deliberately authorized a double refund for the same luxury flower arrangements, pocketing $48,000 into her personal account. She swallowed hard, her face turning a sickly shade of gray, and she quickly tried to close the folder, but Victoria, sensing that something was terribly wrong, reached out and yanked the folder out of Margaret's hands. My mother aggressively flipped to the next page, and then the next. She was staring at her own extensive, categorized list of stolen charity funds. She saw the highlighted merchant IDs for her luxury spa retreats, the 5-star hotel charges that had nothing to do with the gala, and the thousands of dollars spent on high-end designer clothes. Right at the bottom of the master spreadsheet, the final, undeniable total was printed in bold black ink, $312,000 that Victoria's hands actually started shaking. The fake, theatrical tears she had been crying just moments ago instantly dried up. She looked up at me, her eyes completely wild, and tried to fall back on the only defense mechanism she knew, gaslighting. "This is ridiculous," Victoria stammered, her voice an octave higher than normal. "Charity finances are incredibly complicated, Amelia. You don't know how to read these ledgers. These were legitimate event preparation expenses and venue scouting trips. You are deliberately twisting normal operational costs to make us look bad." I didn't blink. I crossed my arms and stared right back at her. "It is not complicated, Mom. You cannot use tax-exempt donor money to buy a designer dress for a Tuesday night dinner, and Margaret cannot authorize double payouts to a florist and route the second check to her personal savings account. You stole $312,000 from a charity. The paper trail is perfect. It includes every single invoice, every payment log, and every single email you two sent authorizing the transfers." Margaret suddenly slammed her hands down on my coffee table, completely losing whatever fragile grip she had left on her temper. She was practically spitting as she yelled at me, desperately trying to justify her blatant theft. "You ungrateful little brat. You have no idea what it takes to run an event of this magnitude. We have to maintain a certain standard of living to keep those rich donors happy. We needed those things to look the part. People believed us because you look trustworthy. The second those words left Margaret's mouth, the entire room went completely dead silent. Even Victoria turned and glared at her sister in absolute horror. Margaret had just accidentally spoken the quiet, ugly truth out loud. They hadn't just used me for my free labor. They hadn't just hidden my name to protect my mother's brand. They had intentionally put all the financial accounts, the LLC registrations, and the merchant gateways in my name because my professional reputation was spotless. They used my clean, highly respected business as a bulletproof human shield to hide their dirty money. They honestly believed that if anyone ever came looking for the missing funds, they would investigate the trustworthy daughter doing the back-end work, leaving them completely untouched. I looked at Margaret and nodded slowly. So that was the plan all along. Let Amelia do the work. Let Amelia take the legal liability, and if the money ever goes missing, just drive up to her apartment and force her to sign a fake confession. That is when Lily finally moved at my younger sister, the absolute golden child who had never been told no a single day in her life, slowly walked over to the coffee table. She looked physically ill. Lily had spent her entire 26 years believing that our mother was a saint, a tireless philanthropist who gave everything to the community. She had believed the flawless, wealthy public image our family projected. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked up my black folder. Victoria immediately tried to snatch it away from her. "Lily, don't look at that. It's just Amelia being spiteful. Put it down." But Lily didn't let go. She pulled the folder close to her chest, stepped back, and started reading the pages. I watched my sister's eyes scan the itemized lists of stolen money. I watched her read the dates of the luxury hotel stays and the massive clothing purchases. I could physically see the exact moment her entire worldview shattered. She finally realized that the luxurious, perfectly curated life she had been enjoying was funded by a massive lie. She began to fully realize that our family had just been using me as a disposable tool. Lily looked up from the papers, her eyes welling with real, genuine tears. She looked at our mother, then at Margaret, and finally at our father, who was still staring at the floorboards, completely unwilling to defend his own children. "You stole it," Lily whispered, her voice cracking. "All of those times you told me Amelia was just too busy to come to family events, or too selfish to help out, she was actually doing all the work so you could steal from the charity." Victoria stepped toward Lily, her hands raised in a desperate pleading motion. "Lily, sweetheart, please understand. We did it for the family. We did it to give you the life you deserve." Lily just shook her head, backing away from our mother as if she were toxic. She dropped the black folder back onto the coffee table, next to the ridiculous, typed-up fake confession they had brought with them. She didn't say another word. She just wrapped her arms around herself and retreated back to the entryway, completely devastated. With Lily completely alienated, Victoria turned her desperate focus back to me. The anger was gone again, instantly replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. She realized that her younger daughter now knew the truth. The board of directors was angry, and her sister had just admitted to financial fraud out loud. She had exactly one card left to play. Victoria picked up a pen from my desk, grabbed the fake legal confession they had brought, and shoved them both toward me. Her hands were shaking violently. "Amelia, please," Victoria begged, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I am your mother. I am asking you, as your mother, to just sign the paper. If you sign it and say it was an administrative glitch with your software, we can fix this. The crisis team will handle the press. We will quietly sell one of the investment properties and refund the $300,000 to the charity. Nobody ever has to go to jail. We can just sweep it under the rug. Please, just do this one last thing for the family." I looked down at the pen in her trembling hand. I looked at the typed document that would permanently destroy my entire professional career, ruin my business, and brand me as a grossly incompetent fraud in my industry. I looked at the woman who had publicly humiliated me at a Christmas dinner table just weeks prior, telling me I should be grateful to even sit near her. That I took a deep breath, looked her directly in the eyes, and said the single most satisfying word I have ever spoken in my entire life. "No," Victoria gasped, stepping back as if I had physically slapped her. "What do you mean, no? You have to. If you don't sign this, the board will call the police. Margaret and I will be ruined. You are destroying your own family over a grudge." I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone completely steady and entirely professional. "I'm not signing it, Mom. And honestly, it wouldn't even matter if I did. I reached out, picked up my black folder containing the actual, damning financial records, and closed it firmly. You are completely out of time. I already sent every single one of these files to the independent audit board. The silence that followed that statement wasn't just heavy, it was apocalyptic. The realization of what I had just said hit Victoria and Margaret simultaneously. There was no more cover-up. There was no more crisis management team to spin the story. The undeniable, legally binding proof of their massive financial fraud was already in the hands of the authorities. The game was entirely, permanently over. The apocalyptic silence in my apartment stretched on for what felt like an eternity after I told them I had already sent the files to the independent audit board. I watched the exact moment the final shred of hope drained completely out of my mother's face. The fake legal confession she was holding fluttered out of her trembling hand and landed on the floor between us. She didn't try to pick it up. She didn't try to yell at me or hit me with another guilt trip about how I was destroying the family. For the very first time in my entire life, Victoria Carter was utterly and completely speechless. Margaret, however, reacted like a cornered animal. She started frantically pacing around my living room, her heavy jewelry clinking as she practically tore at her own hair. She kept repeating the same frantic sentences over and over, desperately trying to convince herself that there was still a way out. She muttered about hiring better lawyers, about calling her friends on the audit board to call in favors, and about claiming her email had been hacked to authorize those fraudulent floral refunds. But even as she said the words out loud, she knew it was entirely useless. The paper trail was absolute perfection, and the authorities already had it in their possession. My father, Richard, finally moved. He didn't look at me, nor did he apologize for standing by while his wife and sister tried to bully me into taking the legal fall for their crimes. He just reached out, grabbed Victoria by the arm, and quietly pulled her toward the front door. He looked like an incredibly old, completely defeated man. He knew that his real estate business was heavily tied to the pristine public reputation of the Carter family, and he knew that reputation was currently burning to the ground. Lily was the last one to leave. She didn't say a single word to our parents or our aunt as they shuffled out into the hallway. She just stopped in the doorway, turned around, and looked at me. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, heartbreaking realization that the perfect family she had grown up in was nothing more than a carefully constructed, deeply toxic lie. She gave me a small, incredibly sad nod, and then she walked out, gently pulling the door shut behind her, and I was finally alone again. I walked over, picked up the fake confession from the floor, and dropped it directly into the trash can. The fallout over the next 3 weeks was absolutely biblical. It was faster and significantly more brutal than even Daniel and I had predicted. The morning after my family drove back to Savannah, the independent audit board officially convened an emergency session. Once they reviewed the black folder containing the highlighted vendor invoices, the duplicated banking logs, and the explicit proof of the stolen $312,000, they had absolutely no choice but to take immediate, severe action. Within 48 hours, the charity's board of directors released a highly publicized press statement. The famous Carter Winter Heritage Gala was officially suspended. The massive charity event, which usually brought in $3 million and served as the absolute crown jewel of Savannah's high society winter season, was completely shut down. The massive luxury tents were never erected. The premium imported flowers were never delivered. The high-end catering companies canceled their orders, and the massive corporate sponsors immediately pulled their funding, demanding full returns on their initial deposits. The local Savannah news outlets completely lost their minds. For years, the Carter family had been treated like local royalty. Now, they were front-page news for all the wrong reasons. The headlines didn't mention a software glitch, and they certainly didn't mention my name. Instead, they focused entirely on the fact that a massive financial audit had been formally launched into the charity's historical records. State financial investigators physically walked into the charity's downtown office and confiscated the remaining hard drives, filing cabinets, and expense reports. Margaret was the very first casualty of the investigation. The board of directors didn't even give her the dignity of a hearing. They confronted her with the exact routing numbers, proving she had pocketed $48,000 in fake floral refunds. Faced with the undeniable threat of immediate criminal prosecution, Margaret had to resign from the board in complete disgrace. She was permanently banned from ever holding a position in any registered nonprofit organization in the state, and she was legally forced to liquidate her personal investment portfolios to instantly pay back the stolen money to avoid going to prison. Why Mother's downfall was even more spectacular. Victoria Carter, the woman who absolutely lived for the public admiration and social power she wielded as the mastermind of the gala, was completely stripped of her title. The board held a private, heavily guarded meeting and informed her that she was being forced to step down as president of the charity immediately. They explicitly told her that if she tried to fight the decision or take the matter to the press, they would publicly release the itemized list of her luxury spa retreats and designer clothing purchases funded by donor money. She had no choice but to sign the resignation papers and walk away from the empire she had spent a decade building on my back. The social exile that followed was absolute. In the wealthy, highly insulated circles of Savannah's elite, your reputation is the only currency that actually matters. Once the news of the financial audit and the forced resignations hit the country clubs and the private dinner parties, the Carter family lost all their social prestige. People who used to beg my mother for invitations to her events suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. Women who used to kiss Margaret on both cheeks at Sunday brunch completely ignored her in the grocery store. My father's real estate firm saw several major investors quietly back out of upcoming commercial deals. Unwilling to be professionally associated with a family currently under investigation for massive charity fraud, they became total pariahs in the exact community they had sacrificed me to impress. They had spent my entire life trying to keep me hidden in the shadows so they could stand in the spotlight. And now, that exact spotlight was aggressively burning them alive. During those 3 weeks, my phone remained relatively quiet. I didn't get any more screaming phone calls from my mother, and Margaret certainly didn't try to drive up to Atlanta again. I spent my days working on my business, casually watching the digital analytics of my LLC. With the charity's massive operational load completely removed from my servers, my systems were running faster and cleaner than ever before. I was finally sleeping 8 hours a night, and I no longer felt the crushing, invisible weight of my family's expectations sitting on my chest that I was entirely prepared to just move on with my life and leave them to deal with the burning wreckage of their own actions. I had successfully extracted myself from their toxic machinery, and I was looking forward to a quiet, drama-free future. But right as the intense public scandal in Savannah was starting to settle into a permanent, humiliating reality for my parents, I received an unexpected visitor. It was late on a Friday afternoon when my apartment intercom buzzed. I wasn't expecting any packages, and Daniel was out of town for a legal conference. I walked over to the panel, pressed the button, and looked at the small, grainy video screen. Standing down in the lobby, looking incredibly nervous and holding a small travel bag, was my sister. Lily had come to see me, and this time, she had come completely alone. I pressed the button on the intercom, unlocking the main lobby doors to let my sister inside. I stood by my open apartment door, waiting for the elevator to bring her up to my floor. When the metal doors finally slid open, I almost didn't recognize her. Lily, the absolute golden child who had spent her entire life perfectly styled and impeccably dressed to maintain our mother's flawless image, looked completely exhausted. She was wearing a plain oversized sweater, no makeup, and her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. She walked down the hallway slowly, clutching the strap of her small overnight bag like a lifeline. I stepped aside and let her walk into my apartment. She dropped her bag by the door and just stood there in my living room, looking around nervously. I didn't rush to hug her, and I didn't offer any immediate comfort. There was still a massive, invisible wall between us, built by 26 years of blatant favoritism and willful ignorance. I walked into the kitchen, poured 2 mugs of hot tea, and set them down on the coffee table, the exact same table where our mother had tried to force me to sign away my future just 3 weeks prior. Lily sat down on the edge of the couch, wrapping both of her hands around the warm mug. We sat in total silence for several minutes. She didn't try to defend our parents, and she didn't ask me to fix the catastrophic mess in Savannah. Finally, she looked up from her tea, her voice trembling slightly. "I moved out," she said quietly. "I packed my things this morning and left. The house in Savannah, it's completely unbearable. Mom is just locking herself in her room, refusing to talk to anyone or answer the phone. Dad is living at his downtown office because the tension is so bad, And Aunt Margaret won't even speak to us after she was forced to liquidate her accounts. Everything is just completely broken. I took a sip of my tea, looking at her over the rim of my mug. It was already broken, Lily. It just had a really expensive coat of paint over it. Lily nodded slowly, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. She looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time in our entire lives, she didn't look at me like I was just the background character in her perfect story. She looked at me like a real person. Lily met with me privately and spoke from her heart. "I am so sorry, Amelia," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I really thought I was just loved more, but I didn't realize you were carrying absolutely everything for them." I set my mug down on the table. I didn't yell, but I didn't sugarcoat the reality of our childhood either. I looked right back at her and gave her the brutally honest truth. "You didn't ask," I replied. She flinched slightly at my words, but she didn't argue. She knew I was right. For her entire life, she had happily accepted the diamond necklaces, the fully funded lifestyle, and the endless praise without ever once questioning why her older sister was always exhausted, always working, and always pushed into the shadows. She had been perfectly comfortable living in the beautiful house, never asking who was actually paying the mortgage with their sweat and tears. "You're right," Lily admitted, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I never asked. I just took whatever they gave me because it was easy. But when I saw those financial papers, when I saw exactly what they were doing to you and how easily they were willing to destroy you to save themselves, I realized I don't actually know who my parents are, and I realized I don't know who I am without them either." I looked at my younger sister, really looked at her, and I felt a tiny, unexpected spark of empathy. She wasn't malicious like Margaret, and she wasn't a calculated narcissist like Victoria. She was just a deeply sheltered kid who was finally waking up to the real world. I told her she could stay in my guest room for a few days to figure things out. It wasn't a magical, instant fix for our relationship, but it was a genuine start. For the first time ever, we were just two sisters sitting in an apartment, completely separated from the toxic gravity of the Carter family. With the charity scandal fully exposed and my ties to Savannah permanently severed, I suddenly found myself entering a completely new life with an overwhelming amount of free time and mental energy. For the past decade, the months leading up to the winter season were a frantic, exhausting blur of 80-hour work weeks. I used to spend every waking moment coding donation platforms, managing aggressive vendors, and designing massive lighting rigs, all for zero pay and absolutely zero public credit. Now, all of that energy was finally mine to keep. I decided it was time to take a massive swing, that I started pouring all of my newly recovered time directly into my own business. I updated my professional portfolio, proudly attaching my name to every single complex design I had secretly built over the years. I stopped hiding behind anonymous LLCs and started taking high-profile client meetings face-to-face. Without my mother's shadow constantly suppressing my ambition, I felt completely unstoppable that a few months after Lily came to stay with me, I saw an open bidding process for a massive, highly coveted architectural project. A historic opera house in Chicago was undergoing a multi-million-dollar renovation, and they were looking for a lead designer to completely overhaul their interior and stage lighting systems. It was the kind of legacy project that entire firms fought over for years. It required a deep understanding of historical preservation, cutting-edge digital infrastructure, and a brilliant aesthetic vision. It was exactly the kind of massive, complex operation I had been secretly running for my family's charity gala for years. I spent 3 weeks drafting my proposal. I didn't hold anything back. I built a comprehensive, stunning digital model of the historic opera house, showcasing exactly how my lighting design would modernize the space while perfectly honoring its historic architecture. I flew out to Chicago, walked right into the boardroom full of strict architectural directors, and confidently pitched my vision. I didn't need a loud, charismatic mascot like my mother to sell my work. My work spoke entirely for itself. 2 weeks later, I got the phone call that completely changed my life. I won the bid and officially received the massive project to design the lighting for the historic opera house in Chicago. It was the biggest professional contract of my entire life, easily dwarfing anything I had ever done for the Carter Winter Heritage Gala. When the official press release was published in the major industry magazines, my name wasn't hidden in the small print or buried under a generic corporate title. It was printed right at the top, bold and impossible to miss. Lead designer, Amelia Carter. Because of this incredible opportunity, my career absolutely exploded overnight. Winning the Chicago project put me on the map in a way I had never experienced before. Suddenly, my phone was ringing constantly, but it wasn't angry vendors or demanding family members. It was high-end architectural firms in New York, massive event planners in Los Angeles, and luxury hospitality brands begging to book my firm for their upcoming projects. I was forced to hire a full-time staff just to keep up with the incoming demand. My business revenue tripled in a matter of months, and I was finally being publicly recognized and highly compensated for the genius I had always possessed. I was building a brilliant, incredibly successful new life entirely on my own terms. I was no longer the invisible workhorse trapped in the basement of my family's ambition. I was a highly respected industry leader, making my own money, building my own legacy, and living completely free of their toxic expectations. But as I would soon find out, the past has a funny way of reaching out right when you finally feel like you have outrun it. Just as I was packing my bags to temporarily relocate to Chicago to begin the physical installation at the Opera House, a thick, handwritten envelope arrived in my mailbox, bearing a very familiar Savannah postmark. I stood in the entryway of my Atlanta apartment, surrounded by half-taped cardboard boxes and heavy plastic storage bins, staring down at the thick, cream-colored envelope resting in the palm of my hand. The return address was printed neatly in the top left corner, but I didn't need to read the elegant, embossed text to know exactly where it had come from. I would recognize my mother's looping, overly dramatic cursive handwriting absolutely anywhere. For a brief, terrible second, a very familiar spike of anxiety hit my chest. It was that old, deeply ingrained childhood reflex telling me that I was in trouble, that I needed to drop whatever I was doing to fix whatever crisis my mother was currently having. But as I looked around my quiet, peaceful apartment, looking at the boxes specifically packed and labeled for my massive new architectural project in Chicago, that anxiety completely evaporated. I was no longer the invisible, terrified workhorse they could bully into submission. I was a highly successful, independent woman who was completely in control of her own destiny. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a small metal letter opener from the counter, and carefully sliced through the heavy paper of the envelope. Inside was a long, 3-page handwritten letter. I leaned against the cold granite of the kitchen island, took a deep breath, and started reading. I honestly expected the pages to be filled with another highly manipulative guilt trip, or perhaps a desperate, angry plea for financial help now that the charity scandal had completely ruined my parents' social standing and my father's real estate business. I braced myself for the usual gaslighting and the classic shifting of blame, but it wasn't any of those things. For the very first time in my 31 years of life, Victoria Carter actually dropped her carefully curated, heavily polished public relations act. The letter was a raw, shockingly honest, and completely unfiltered confession. The handwriting itself was shaky, lacking the confident, aggressive strokes she usually used when signing massive vendor checks or writing out her expensive gala invitations. She wrote openly about the absolute collapse of her life in Savannah. She admitted, with brutal clarity, that she was completely addicted to the public admiration and the intoxicating social status she held in the community. She confessed that the charity gala had originally started as a relatively normal philanthropic effort, but over the years, the massive praise and the front-page newspaper articles had mutated into an absolute obsession with maintaining a flawless, wealthy, and powerful public image. The second page of the letter is where she finally addressed my role in her empire. My mother explicitly confessed that she had knowingly and willingly sacrificed her own daughter for the sake of her public reputation. She admitted that she kept my name strictly hidden in the shadows because she simply couldn't stomach the idea of sharing the spotlight. She knew perfectly well that if the board of directors or the wealthy corporate sponsors ever saw how brilliant I was at handling the complex logistics, they would instantly realize she was nothing more than a loud, expensive figurehead. She apologized for the Christmas dinner. She apologized for the stolen money. She apologized for standing by while Aunt Margaret treated me like absolute garbage. She wrote that sitting alone in her massive, incredibly quiet house in Savannah, with her social circle completely abandoning her and her reputation in absolute ruins, she finally realized the catastrophic price of her vanity. She had traded her oldest daughter for the applause of absolute strangers, and now, when the music had finally stopped, she had neither did I read the entire 3-page letter twice. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, but not oppressive. A year ago, a letter exactly like this would have completely wrecked me. I would have cried, immediately picked up my phone, and tried to comfort her. I would have abandoned my own life, canceled my professional contracts, and rushed right back to Savannah to help her rebuild her shattered world. But standing there in my kitchen, physically holding the undeniable proof of her regret, I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. I didn't feel angry anymore, but I also didn't feel a sudden, magical rush of forgiveness. I simply felt detached, like I was reading a sad story about a woman I used to know a very long time ago. I carefully folded the 3 pages back together, matching the deep creases in the heavy paper, and slid them back into the cream-colored envelope. I walked over to my home office desk, opened the bottom drawer, dropped the letter inside, and pushed the drawer firmly shut. I decided right then and there that I would not reply to her immediately. Honestly, as I looked at the closed drawer, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to reply to her at all. She needed to sit in the uncomfortable, quiet reality of the consequences she had meticulously built for herself, and I needed to go catch a flight to Chicago to start my real life. The next several months of my life were an absolute whirlwind of incredible professional success and deep personal growth. I temporarily relocated to Chicago to oversee the massive historic opera house renovation. Walking into that beautiful, cavernous building on the very first day of heavy construction, wearing a hard hat with my actual name explicitly printed on the front, was the single most validating experience of my entire career. I wasn't hiding in a dark basement coding a secret donation platform. I was standing right on the main stage, actively directing a massive crew of union electricians and high-end architectural engineers. My career continued to explode in the best way possible. The project was heavily featured in several major design publications, and my firm's revenue absolutely skyrocketed. I was finally building a brilliant legacy entirely on my own terms, without having to share a single ounce of the credit with anyone who didn't actually do the work. Meanwhile, Lily stayed in my apartment down in Atlanta, slowly figuring out how to navigate the complexities of the real world without our parents' massive, toxic financial safety net. She got a regular job, started paying her own bills, and we made it a point to talk on the phone almost every single evening. Our relationship certainly wasn't perfect, and we still had a massive amount of heavy childhood baggage to unpack together, but it was finally real. We were no longer just playing the specific roles our mother had assigned to us. When I look back at that miserable, humiliating Christmas dinner in Savannah, it honestly feels like it happened in an entirely different lifetime. I still think about that exact moment when my mother looked at me from across the table, surrounded by the expensive crystal and the luxury gifts, and told me I should be grateful to even be allowed at her table. She genuinely thought she was putting me in my place. She thought she was firmly reminding me of my low status in her perfect, wealthy family, but all she really did was give me the exact, brutal push I needed to finally stand up, walk out the front door, and build my own table. I learned a very hard, very ugly truth about the people who raised me, but it was a truth that ultimately set me completely free. You absolutely cannot buy genuine respect with free, endless labor, and you cannot earn the love of a deeply selfish narcissist by making yourself completely invisible to the world. I spent over a decade of my adult life desperately trying to prove my worth to a family that was actively exploiting my desire for their approval for their own financial and social gain. I will never, ever make that mistake again. I now know exactly what my time, my skills, and my peace of mind are worth. I know exactly what a healthy, supportive relationship actually looks like. The ultimate lesson I took away from the absolute collapse of the Carter family is incredibly simple, and it is something I will firmly carry with me for the rest of my life, that if love only appears when you work for them, that's not a family. That's an unpaid labor contract.